this happened. And that's when Mass was celebrated for the first time in St. Stephen's Church in Kilcarn, which is 832 years ago. It is probable that the local native Irish population continued to use the earlier patrician church, the Black Church, as their parish church, for a while at least. There's no record of when it ceased. But more importantly, they would have continued to use it as a burial ground. And this is significant because after Geoffrey de Filippo passed the Black Church in Kilcarn as it was, this area became known as Old Town. So that could be a Norman reference to the fact that that was past history and now they're in new history. But that's supposition. But significantly, as no cemetery was built at Kilcarn in 1192, they just had the church. The Normans, for their part, had to resort to carrying their dead from Kilcarn all the way up to St. Columskill's Church in Screen for burial there, which ultimately proved a little too onerous for both the clergy and the parishioners. Geoffrey de Filippo then endowed Kilcarn Church with a messuage, or dwelling, which was rented by Chaplain Thomas of Tycarn. It was still known as Tycarn, as well as a boundary ditch, which was very important at the time for security. And then, on the orders of Bishop Simon de Rochfort, who was the first English Bishop of Meath, who had changed the headquarters of the bishopric from Clonard to Trim, and was based in Trim, between 1217 and 1223, a cemetery was opened and blessed in Great Kilcarn. So it's now called Great Kilcarn. It's not exact when the cemetery was opened, but it was opened within those 6 years. And this is the same cemetery that is in use to this day. So the church was there from 1192, and the cemetery is there from at least 1217. So a lot of history. Bishop de Rochfort is commemorated on the fine plaque at the cemetery entrance. Because of the continuing generous patronage of the de Filippo family, they retain the right to appoint their own curate or cure. In other words, he that pays the piper calls the tune. While the administration, as described above, continued to be vested in the Cistercian Abbey in St. Mary's in Dublin. So everybody was happy. The assertion of Mrs. Hickey that St. Patrick founded a church at Old Town was disputed in 1981 by the then parish priest of Kilskeer, Father Conor McGreevy, who, in a different interpretation of the Book of Armagh, as in one passage, Cerne being the burial place of Erk, and placing Cerne in the townland of the Carns near Dreleek, according to the scholar O'Curry. And in the second passage, he interprets St. Patrick as founding a church at Segi, S-E-G-I, modern-day Assay or Assay, and another church of Holy Kinnera on the fort of Carnoy, which is modern-day Canistown on the Boyne. So we have a difference of opinion here. But really, regardless of the founder of the church, who according to Dean Cogan again may have been St. Servanus, a disciple of St. Patrick, the evidence of the Black Church in Old Town can still be seen today in one specific area of the field by the appearance of exposed stones in dry summers. As regards the cemetery, human skulls and bones were uncovered in the 1830s when the field was ploughed for potatoes at the time, before the famine. So, regardless of whether Patrick founded the church or whether his disciples founded the church, there was a church there. Dean Cogan, when compiling his Diocese of Meath in 1867, hoped, as the field had subsequently been returned to grass after the crop of potatoes, that no rude hand will offer any additional disturbance to the rest of the dead. And his wishes and the dead have been fully and faithfully respected on that farm ever since, as the field has remained in grass since then. Human bones have appeared in the field's small River Nanny tributary stream in the 60s during necessary reclamation work on the stream, which I had personally witnessed. In an unrelated context, this field is reputed to contain a stray sod, which if stepped upon at night, renders the unfortunate stepper to wandering aimlessly round the field until daybreak. Whether drink has taken hold or not, I'm not terribly sure, but the legend is there. Apparently it happened to my grandfather, who was a very abstemious individual, so we have to believe the legend. According to Catherine O'Brien also, the Black Church in Old Town was linked by a souterrain or underground passage to Kilcarn Church, and then on to the great Bective Abbey on the other side of the Boyne. And the story goes that as Cromwell's troops were advancing onto the Black Church with menace, the monks were escaping through the tunnels. As the last monk entered the tunnel at Old Town, the first monk was alighting at Bective and into relative safety. Across from Kilcarn Church and Cemetery is the Oaks, formerly Casey family farm, where an underground cave was discovered and partially excavated. A boar's tooth was found in what appeared to be a man-made cavern. It was left open for a number of years, but was closed after a bullet fell into it and broke a leg. Casey Oaks, a member of that family, recorded a series of interviews in the 60s with his screen neighbour Elizabeth Hickey, and he recounts travelling along a man-made passage in the lawn field at Crowboy, which is immediately adjacent to Kilcarn Cemetery, until he was blocked from going any further by a collapse in the passage. And he also refers to caves in the Raheen field, adjacent to the Rath, there. This recollection is also verified by another man with great local knowledge, the late James Bradley, who spoke of caves also in the Raheen field. Casey Oaks also recounts a story of how a seasonal worker on his farm dreamed that money was buried in the Raheen field, and so he stealthily ventured up with a spade at night to investigate. The spade and a few excavations were discovered on the next day, but no sign of the amateur archaeologist was ever seen again. So we don't know what happened. But certainly it does give some credibility to the possible existence of underground passages or souterrains associated with both pagan and Christian establishments in the area, notwithstanding the considerable engineering skills required to tunnel under the Boyne. No proper archaeological investigation has ever been undertaken to verify the existence of this tunnel network. Perhaps it should be investigated at some stage. We move on through the centuries to the Reformation. It was a relatively quiet time in the 13th and 14th century. Not a lot happened. Things were in relative peace in the country, so therefore in Kilcarn as well. But then we had the Reformation under King Henry VIII, another Henry that made a difference. Beginning in 1537, when Roman Catholic churches and monastic settlements were suppressed on both sides of the Irish Sea, onto the 1641 insurrection, when Ireland was in the throes of strife, rebellion and fierce retribution, and when St. Stephen's Church was badly damaged. Then reputedly Cromwell and his army added to the wanton destruction of the church in 1649-50. Despite the damage from the 1640s, and following a change in religious denomination brought about by the Reformation, the Kilcarn Church appeared to be still in use, as Henry Moneypenny was recorded as an Anglican rector there in 1674 and again in 1677. So it was now a Protestant church. Notwithstanding its possible continued use since 1641, the Dublin-born Anglican Bishop Anthony Dopping's account between 1682 and 1685 states that the church and chancel, that's the area around the altar, had not been repaired since 1641, and that the church and cemetery were now not fenced in, which was very ominous. Today, sadly, only one of the beautiful Gothic church windows of the church remains intact. It is improbable that the church was used after the departure of the last rector as a church. Between the departure of the last rector and its reunion back with the church in Screen in 1677. So really from that period on, it was not used as a church anymore. While the church then went into significant decline in out of use, The cemetery, however, remained in use, according to parochial records and headstones, at least from 1709. Following the closure of the Catholic churches and the suppression of the religious houses in the area, Lady Dowdall of Athlumney granted a site in the nearby townland of Baylis or Alexander Aid for a mud-walled Catholic chapel there around the year 1669. This holy edifice closed 10 years later, when sadly the patronage had changed to a veteran of the Siege of Derry called Eklund, who, unlike Lady Athlumney, would lose no ground with mass houses, according to Dean Cogan. Dean Cogan also informs us that in 1704, Reverend Charles Riley, who lived at Brennanstown, was registered as the popish priest of Mountown, Downstown, Kilcarn, now spelled with two L's, Kilkieran and Follestown, to be followed by Patrick McCullen as the popish priest of Athlumney. Mr. Cusack of Johnstown then granted a site for the building of a mud-walled edifice whose foundations decayed, to be followed by another mud-walled chapel which was donated by a Protestant man called Noe in 1764. Reverend James Callaghan was then appointed pastor of the United Parishes of Kilcarn and Waterstown in 1788. During this time, as I said, St. Stephen Church was not in use as a church and wouldn't be ever again, but the cemetery was still in active use. This chapel survived, the chapel donated by Mr. Noe, until the present Johnstown Church was built by Father Michael Reid in 1837, where the church now stands in Johnstown. And this was 8 years after the passing of the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829. Christopher Casey, an antecedent of Casey Oaks above, was chairman of the committee to raise funds for the building of this church by a series of subcontracted tradesmen, and I've caught sight of the paperwork where every tradesman, they were subcontracted. Some did the gallery, some did the stonework, some did the carpentry, and everything was meticulously recorded, what they were paid, and they all had to tender for it. Recently discovered records show that at least £500 sterling was raised for the church, and subsequently at least £250 for the subsequent building of the adjacent National School, now the site of the current parochial house. It is interesting to note that the person who tendered for the school, a man called Carroll, his tender was 290, but he came in at 250. So perhaps they should have got him for the children's hospital. So these funds depended solely on local contributions of as little as 1 penny per week. So that took a bit of gathering. The church was renovated and seats were installed in the 1860s. Prior to that, you had to stand and kneel, obviously. This is the fine church that we have here today and is the parochial successor to St. Stephen's Church. There are two ancient stone fonts in Johnstown Church. One is a plain 15th century stone font, and it originally came from a church in nearby Follestown, which I have visited, but it is long in ruins and is covered in its own well-vegetated and biodiverse enclosure. In other words, it's a jungle and is surrounded by farmland. The other 15th century font, however, originally came from St. Stephen's Church and was described in Wakeman's Weekly as a gem in its way and well worthy of a visit, following its appearance at the Great Exhibition in England in 1853. And this was at the instigation of our friend Dr. Cogan, who was the Johnstown curate at the time. And it has been included in Helen M. Rowe's scholarly tome called Medieval Fonts of Meath, published in 1968. The titles and lands of the Baron of Screen had passed by marriage from the De Filippo family to the Marward family in the 15th century, and it is probable that this was the family who both re-edified St. Stephen's Church and also donated this magnificent font to the parish. It is a 15th century font known as the Great Apostle font, or the Kilcarn font. It is very famous, and it has 12 sides. It's dodecagonal, Wasn't sure about that, but I got that. Which is unusual for a medieval font. The sides contain beautiful carvings of the 12 apostles, with Christ as a king with a globe and cross, while he blesses the crowned Virgin Mary. On the underside, there are carvings of various animals and humans, including a foliage-clad human head called the Green Man, according to Helen Rowe. In her book, the esteemed author and renowned expert is loud in her praise of one of the rarest of all English or Irish fonts. She is less complimentary about the damage caused to the font, probably by stone throwing, and also by the remedial action taken to repair the font in the form of a lead brace. After the demise of St. Stephen Church in the late 17th century, but while still in use as a cemetery, tradition has it that after a funeral, local youths would test their strength by throwing stones or large rocks into the font from a distance, which did little for its either shape or survival. In order to save it from destruction, a local family called Welch then buried it for safety, possibly under the west end of the church, but it was hidden anyway somewhere, thereby saving it for future generations. A member of that family, Christopher Lynch, who died in 1742, had a plaque erected in his memory within the church itself. There are not many plaques within the church. It is unclear when the font was exhumed, but it was brought from the church by Edward Casey, this time also from Crowboy, to its new resting place in the newly built Johnstown church, where it has pride of place ever since. Regardless of the exact timelines of hiding and of the exhumation of the font, the Welsh family did a great service to the parish, to the font, and to us. It was initially situated at the entrance of the church in Johnstown, and it remained there for years in use as a water font at the entrance door, but it was placed within the sanctuary in 1983, and since then